So my name is Christina Knowles. I'm one of the assistant professors in music theory at the School of Music here at ASU. And the School of Music itself is part of the larger Herberger Institute for Design in the Arts, which is sort of a complex that combines the School of Art, the School of Dance, the School of Music, and a number of engineering schools together under one roof. So as a music theory researcher and someone who also does work in music cognition, I'm very excited for this gathering of people coming together to talk about science and the arts and questions of perception that combine the two of them. I'd also like to take a couple of minutes just to say a few words about the SAMBA group, which is one of the co-sponsors for this event. SAMBA stands for Science of Art, Music, and Brain Activity, and I credit Mike Beth with coming up with that acronym. Many people think we are a dance group, but no, we are a group of interdisciplinary scholars that are pulling together sort of researchers from different departments across ASU. So members from the School of Music, we have some individuals from the School of Dance, along with faculty from the cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience departments coming together to look at questions like music cognition, auditory perception, and visual perception, and seeking to find what can come out of these sort of cross-disciplinary collaborations. So it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for our afternoon session on science, art, music, and timing. Frank Russo is a professor of psychology at the Ryerson University, where he holds the Hear the World Research Chair in Music and Emotional Speech. He also holds a number of affiliate positions with partner institutions such as the Toronto Rehabilitation Institute, the McMaster Institute for Music and the Mind, and the University of Toronto's Music and Health Collaboratory. His research focuses on the biological, cognitive, and social emotional bases of music and speech, with related areas of applied research, including efforts to develop and optimize assistive and rehabilitative technologies to support perception and production of vocal facial emotion, and assessing the potential for music-based interventions to contribute to health and well-being. Beyond the academy, Russo seeks creative collaborations with artists, community-based groups, and industry, which have resulted in the sensory substitution technology, new algorithms to support music perception through hearing aids, and the development of singing interventions to support communication deficits. Today he will be talking about his work on music and emotional speech. Please join me in welcoming Frank Russo.
It's a pleasure to be here. This really was a surprise invitation, but it's a marrying of things that I'm interested in, the arts, cognition, and science in general. So I'm happy to be here. I'm making lots of notes, and I'm sure I'll get a nice big picture perspective on the kinds of things I study already, but I'll be thinking about them in new ways, and hopefully we'll all do a bit of that. Okay, so there's a bunch of words in my title. Motor system, for those of you that are not in psychology and neuroscience, this is a part of the brain that is involved in coordinating and executing, even planning and anticipating movements. So I'm going to be talking about the role of this motor system in how we perceive music and how we perceive emotional speech. So you might also be wondering, what does he mean by emotional speech? In my mind, all speech is emotional in a way. Like I can do my best to speak in a neutral tone, but what I'm referring to is when the listener is trying to listen for emotion rather than the words. So it's in these cases that I think that the motor system is particularly important. So before I get to the heart of the story, we're going to start with a little bit of a demonstration. So I'm going to play you a piece of music, and I think the music conveys some emotion, and I'm interested in the emotion that you hear in this piece of music that I assume you've never heard before, because it's produced by people in northern Thailand in a very mountainous remote region where they don't actually record their music. So this is a recording from an ethnomusicologist. I don't think we have the audio connected, so just a second. Let's try again.
Is my phone picking it up?
It's coming out of here.
I know, it's supposed to be
It's
coming out
just
of
a
here.
strange place. It's a tinny kind of, that's okay. Okay, so let's pretend it wasn't tinny. That's not the way it was recorded, but what kind of emotions are people hearing? Do people, sorry, did I hear happy?
Yeah.
Okay. What else do people hear? Did anyone hear something different?
It sounds a lot like the funeral procession in Chinese.
Yeah, okay. So here we have some cultural experience. It is a funeral march. So although it's from a very remote region, and maybe you haven't heard this particular recording, some people in the audience have heard something like it and they've formed a cultural association. So definitely one of the ways in which we perceive emotion in music is through cultural association. I don't think it's the only way. I think that there's something to be said for listening to the kind of movements that are involved in producing that music. And somehow that's a gateway into understanding the emotion that the individuals were experiencing while they were performing the piece of music. The same can be said for understanding emotion in speech. Sometimes you can pick up that someone's happy because you've heard this familiar sing-song tone in somebody's voice and you know that means they're happy, but maybe it's something about the movements in their voice that you're cueing into that are conveying the happiness. That's what I'm suggesting. So this is a really old idea. It's definitely not my idea. We can trace it back to at least the 50s. And this is a picture of Alvin Lieberman, who was at Haskins Laboratories. There was a group at Haskins who developed an entire theory of speech perception that suggested that the way we understand speech, and I mean the words of speech now, not the emotion in speech, the way we understand speech is by processing the articulatory gestures rather than the sounds on their own. So yes, we hear the sounds of speech, but the idea is that what we're hearing are the way that the articulators are moving. And that's the way that we can make sense of ambiguities in speech. You're probably scratching your head right now and saying, that's ridiculous. Like, why would we come up with such a silly system? Why not just take the words and associate them with meaning? I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I don't think they were saying that. But there are instances where the words are confusing. So the same word can be said differently by different people. I might say television. At one point in the day, I might say television. At one point in the day, I might say television. Television. It's all different. So how is it that we are reading this as the same word every time? Maybe there's something about the movements in the vocal track that people are cueing into. I'm sure that the majority of the audience is not convinced of this, but I'm going to go on and show you some examples about why this might be true, at least on some level. I'm going to ask you to think about the example now of a baby who hasn't yet formed associations between words and meaning, words and semantic meaning. What is it that they're doing when they're babbling all day? You know, are they just exercising their chops, hoping that one day they'll get it right and they'll be able to orate brilliantly? I don't think so. I think that what they're doing is that they're honing in to the linguistic structures that they're exposed to. They're reinforcing them through production and clarifying the different kinds of words that they're hearing. So this is a short video of someone.
I think it's just, you have to switch your audio output from HDMI to...
That's a tech thing. Should I try it in the middle?
I can try that.
Sure, yeah.
Because there's literally no other cable going to there. That's
Sounds
the
good.
logic as to why that would play sound.
So,
If you don't mind me taking a minute of your...
you're also editing my presentation. So let's just try it before I explain. Yeah, that's better.
Time-lapse videos.
Okay, so this is Deb Roy. He's from the Cognitive Machines group at MIT, and he did what a lot of linguists, psychologists, a lot of people interested in word learning would like to do. He recorded every single word that his son spoke for the first few years of his son's life. He did this by putting microphones and cameras in every room of the house. I know this sounds terribly creepy, but this is great. This is very exciting, because now what we can do is we can look at the development of language. So this is just a short video where he gives you a snapshot about one word that he captured in his son's development.
Where a flower will blossom as you accelerate time. I'd like you to now time-lapse videos where a flower will blossom as you accelerate time. I'd like you to now experience the blossoming of a speech form. My son, soon after his first birthday, would say gaga to mean water. And over the course of the next half year, he slowly learned to approximate the proper adult form, water. So we're going to cruise through half a year in about 40 seconds. No video here, so you can focus on the sound, the acoustics of a new kind of trajectory. Gaga to water. He sure nailed it, didn't he? You've all,
Okay, so.
you've all, I'm sure, seen time.
Okay, so what I would argue is happening here is that he started out with gaga, had the wrong phoneme altogether, and through successive approximations, he locked onto each phoneme and he clarified the sound. So it's sort of like experimentation by this old idea of experimentation by synthesis. So he tries different things until he finds what it is that he's hearing, and now he's locked on to a perceptual category. So this is a way in which moving informs perception. Okay, this is just one snapshot, but I would argue that this is really critical in the development or learning of any system. Some more support for this motor view of speech perception can be seen in an illusion called the McGurk effect. Now, you've probably seen this somewhere, but like all illusions in psychology, the reason that we tend to be interested in them is not just because they're neat party tricks and there's something funny or interesting about them, but they tell us something about the mechanisms of perception. So we'll speak about the mechanisms in just a moment. Let's watch this description of the McGurk effect.
Watch this experiment. It's called the McGurk effect.
Ba, 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 ba.
What do you think he's saying? If you think he's saying da, 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 you are in the grand majority. But now, close your eyes and listen instead of watching.
Ba, ba,
Your eyes should be closed.
ba, 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 ba.
The voice is saying ba, ba, ba. Now, let's replay it without the sound. Yes, it's true. His lips are saying ga, ga, ga. So how is it that when the lips are saying ga, 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 and the sound says ba, 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 that our brains read da, da, da?
Okay, I'm going to stop it there because he's not able to give us the answer. But one interpretation of this is that ba, the articulation of ba is towards the front of the vocal tract, towards the lips, whereas ga is earlier on in the vocal tract. Ga, you can feel, where's ga, where's the articulation happening? Ga, 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 ba, ba, ba. What we heard when we mixed the auditory ba and the visual ga is something in the middle, something like da, 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 okay? So I think this is another example of using the motor system. We are, what we're hearing is some compromise between the point of articulation that's given by the auditory stimulus and the point of articulation that's given by the visual stimulus. This is a rare, really rare instance. This wouldn't happen in normal speech, but it's support for this view that we use the motor system or we rely on the motor system in certain instances when we're processing speech.
Watch the...
Okay, another way we can look at this is by creating a temporary lesion. So we can use a transcranial magnetic stimulation to actually create a focal area of the brain where the cells are less excitable. And so they're not going to function the same way that they normally would. So in this experiment that I'll tell you about, they presented McGurk-like stimuli, just like what you observed. Then they did this brain stimulation, creating this local lesion. And then they did the tasks again. They waited 30 minutes, and then they did the tasks one more time. So the hypothesis would be that if we're creating a focal lesion in the articulatory motor area, this area where the motor plans are being generated, that we should affect the ability to do this task. And that is what the data support. So I'm not going to get into this, I'm just going to go straight to this. So they did the TMS in two areas. Once they did it in the area of the motor the motor area that controls the hand, and that's this curve, and once they did it for the lip area. And what we can see is that there's much less integration happening when they do the focal lesion in the lip area. Okay, so it's not simply a product of messing with the brain. We messed with the brain in some way, and we minimize the ability to integrate these things. You had to mess with the brain in the right area. It was in the area that controlled the lips. Okay, so some more support for this idea. And I should foreshadow by saying, this theory of motor speech is now, it's discredited. No one believes in it, but there's support for it. So the current view is, in what instances is the motor system involved, not is it the way in which we're perceiving speech exclusively. So the other place that we see the use of the motor system, I think, is when we get unusual instances of speech. So, you know, sometimes the words really don't sound at all like what they normally sound like. And someone who's drunk is a brilliant example. So we're going to listen to a drunk speech that I found on the internet, and it's a bonus because it comes with an accent. It's British, and it's noisy. So it's noisy, it's drunk, and these are all good things that should encourage you to use your motor systems to figure out what it is that he's trying to say.
Okay. Me and Dave have been great friends ever since we first met at school. We're 11 years old.
I want it to be hard. Focus.
Yeah. So he didn't need to use the hair loss that he's using right now on his head. Look at him!
Okay, so I don't see people smiling. Maybe some people got a bit of the humor, but the words were pretty incomprehensible, and if we broke them down word by word, it'd be hard to do. But I think you got little bits here and there, and the idea is that when the auditory system is challenged, that we might rely more heavily on the motor system to fill in the gaps. So this is another kind of ecological example. So this is what I was talking about earlier. There's two ways to think about the role of the motor system. One is that sound goes into the auditory cortex, somehow it consults with the motor cortex, and then that goes into some kind of language representation. The other idea is that the auditory input is entirely mediated by the processing in the motor areas. This is what I would call the hard view, the hard theory. This is the soft theory concerning the role of the motor system in speech perception. But what I want to argue is that, I would never argue for this version of the theory, but I want to argue that this reliance on the motor system might happen quite a bit when we're trying to understand emotional speech, because it's a little different from the typical examples. It might be especially important when we're trying to understand music, especially music that we're not familiar with. So there's a few ways in which we already have evidence that the motor system is involved in the perception of music. And maybe the most obvious one that comes to mind is dancing, right? I hear music and I just gotta dance. I hear the song that I like, or there are certain songs that just make me want to dance. So what's the evidence for the recruitment of the motor system when we're listening to music? Well, it seems that areas that are involved in planning and in initiation of motor movements, areas like the premotor cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum are also involved when we're listening to rhythm in music, even when we're just listening to rhythm alone. The extent of motor involvement is predicted by the rhythmic complexity. So you can imagine something being more rhythmically complex. We could call that syncopated. We could call that having high groove. That's going to engage the motor system more. And there also seems to be coupling that happens between auditory and motor areas when we're processing rhythm in music. So all of this evidence comes from magnetic resonance imaging. Now, one of the shortcomings of fMRI is, of course, the temporal resolution. And another way that we can look at this kind of processing in the brain is by looking at EEG, or looking at electrical potentials through scalp electrodes. And we have very good temporal fidelity in EEG, and we also have some evidence for entrainment to rhythm and entrainment in motor areas. So the idea is that your cells in your brain they're not just dormant or active, they're oscillating in some way. They fire in a particular way, and they have their own oscillatory pattern. But what happens when we're listening to rhythmic music is that the oscillation in the rhythm takes over the oscillation in the local area. And you get some kind of phase locking taking place, and then that new external rhythm becomes the internal rhythm. So what we can do is we can subject the EEG recordings to a Fourier transform. We can subject the rhythm to a Fourier transform, and we can look at correspondence in the frequencies. And we see that there is correspondence. So here is a very simple rhythm. It's just a metronome. Maybe you don't even want to call it a rhythm. And it's at 2.4 hertz. So we put a signal in at 2.4 hertz, and we measure from the scalp electrodes. We do the Fourier analysis. Lo and behold, we find energy at 2.4 hertz. One interesting thing is that if you ask people to imagine a meter, so you still play just the metronome, but now you ask them to imagine it in two. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Although all you're hearing is, but you imagine 1, 2, 1, 2. Or you ask them to imagine 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. the sole act of imagining actually changes the neural representation. So you can see that we've got energy at 1.2 hertz when we ask people to imagine the rhythm in 2. We can see that we have energy at 1.6 and 0.8 hertz when we ask people to imagine the rhythm in 3. So it's not just the stimulus here, but it's also our imagining the structure in the stimulus that affects the neural representation. I should say that these EEG recordings are taking place, there's no localization of the signal. It's looking at all of the electrical potentials across the scalp. We can use independent components analysis and try to do some source localization on the EEG signal and look specifically at what's happening in motor areas. There's some controversy about how well we can do this, but let's assume it's fine. And what we've observed in my lab is that if you present people with high groove music, you get more entrainment in premotor areas than you do if you present people with low groove music. So we didn't decide what was low groove and what was high groove. We relied on a database that was empirically established. So they asked people to rate a whole bunch of pieces on how groovy they were. And they defined grooviness by how much does this piece of music make you want to dance or move. And on the basis of that database, we find that those high groove pieces, lo and behold, they actually lead to more entrainment in motor planning areas than low groove music. So all that to say that I think we've got it figured out. I think we've got it figured out as to why you want to dance with certain kinds of music. It's not just some sort of association. There's the spontaneous feeling of wanting to move is grounded in what's happening in motor planning areas. So I'm going to slide horizontally a little bit and raise an interesting hypothesis from colleague Ani Patel. It's the action stimulation for auditory prediction hypothesis. And the idea is that we rely on the motor system when we're processing different aspects of sound and music in order to make predictions about what's going to happen next. So there's something about the simulation of movement that allows us to anticipate what's going to happen. So one piece of support for this idea is that we find that there are only a few species that can dance. So humans can dance. You might think that our closest primates should be able to dance. There's very limited evidence for chimps and gorillas being able to dance. Like, I think you can construct the paradigm just so and look for the dancing, but it's not easy to find. But if you look at vocal learners, so songbirds are a great example. Some types of seals you can describe as vocal learners. They seem to be able to dance to the beat, and they seem to be able to do it flexibly. It's not just a parlor trick. So let's have a look. This is a very famous cockatoo, I guess. It's Snowball. Hundreds of YouTube videos. So, yeah.
Can they make music?
Can they? Yes, they can. Yeah. Besides singing. Oh, can they play music if you gave them an instrument? I don't know if we have any evidence for that. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some operant conditioning that they'd be rather good at it. And to carry the theory forward, the idea is there are tight links between their auditory cortex and their motor cortex that enable vocal learning. And this is, although we share so much of our DNA with chimpanzees, theoretically they should not have the same level of coupling between the auditory and motor systems. So they should be less able to learn to play an instrument than a cockatoo would. Okay, so what happens if we feel the beat rather than hear the beat? So I'm saying that it's something about auditory motor coupling, or a bunch of people in my field are saying it's about auditory motor coupling. What if we present music that we feel? So you've all felt music in a loud car, in a club. So we've devised methods of putting sound on the body. The challenge with this is you always hear that sound because of bone conduction, but we do our best to mask that sound. And our reviewers push us very hard to do that, and I think we've mastered how to mask the auditory part of vibratory music. And so what we do is we present, we use voice coils, which are basically the core part of a speaker, but without the cone. And we put them on the body. We either embed them in a chair or we put them right on the body. And we drive them with an audio signal. And we don't have to do any fancy transformation. I can take the same piece of music, play it to someone, and they can hear it, or I can play it to their body. The only trick is I have to mask what they're hearing, and that's doable. You can ask me about how we do that later if you're interested. So, interesting, there's a bunch of things I could say about this, but to stick with the theme about the involvement of the motor system, I'll point out, oh, it's a bit warped here. I'll point out that what we had people do is tap to the beat. So we give them a rhythm and we have them tap along to it. And then we can look at how good they are at doing this. And we find that we're not very good. We get much higher standard deviation of asynchronies for tactile presentations of rhythm. Auditory presentations of rhythm we're much better at. Auditory tactile presentations we're the same at. So our interpretation of this is that the tactile is doing nothing for us. At least in this instance. We actually have some other evidence that suggests it does do some things in some cases. But my read on this is that we don't have those somatosensory motor couplings available to us that enable this, at least not on this time course, that enables vocal learning, dance, music, things like this. I don't know if that makes sense to people. That we're basically going in through another sensory system, but we're not observing the same behavior. I think to really be sure about this, we need to replicate this work with congenitally deaf people, and we're doing that now. So we've also presented these tactile rhythms to people and recorded brainwaves, and we've looked at energy in the fundamental frequency, just as I was showing you before, and we see a similar kind of pattern. So here, again, this is a replication of this study I just showed you. So when we present vibration, people are less good at tapping along than they are in auditory or auditory tactile. And when we look at entrainment in the brain, auditory and auditory tactile is better than vibe. Okay? So we can't drive, we can't get these populations of neurons firing at the rate of the brain, of the beat. We can't phase lock their cycling with the periodic patterns in the music. And I would suggest that's something about our biology. Okay, so a related idea in the realm of music, some of you might be thinking, is this somehow connected to the mirror neuron system? So that's a system that's received a lot of press, and unfortunately, sometimes the interpretations run away from the data, but I think there's something real in that. I'm not undermining that the idea that we have a mirror system as humans. So let me define what a mirror system is. The mirror system is basically this idea that we simulate other people's movements in order to understand them. So how do I learn how to walk as an infant? This is sort of like the story I was telling earlier. I run some kind of internal simulation, and then much like I'm babbling, now I'm in my crib and I'm kicking my legs and trying to figure out this motion And so eventually, even after I've mastered walking, some of how I interpret other people's actions is by running this internal simulation of movement. So I could say a lot more about that, where the mirror system is involved. There's very little evidence for mirror neurons. Again, if people are curious about this, I can unpack that a little bit, but there is evidence for a mirror system. And the mirror system seems to involve areas in motor planning areas, in inferior frontal gyrus, and in the inferior parietal cortex. So areas that are involved with motor planning and areas that are involved with body awareness. So I'm going to show you a movie that's a stitching together of MRI images, and this is from Ed Large's group. What he did here is he asked people to listen to a piece of music, Chopin Etude, and what you'll notice is that there are motor planning areas that are lighting up, so areas around here in these different views of the brain, and they're particularly lighting up at times in the music where we have what I would call expression. So we have a slowing down or a speeding up, some kind of expressive movement is happening in the music. And it's in those instances that it seems that we're engaging the motor system. So let's watch the video. So we just had some slowing down. Okay, so that's as much as I'm going to show here. It's some interesting correlational evidence support. We have EEG methods for looking at this mirror system activation as well. I'm not going to unpack the methods too much, but this is another example of you can give the same stimulus to people. In this case, it's just a melodic interval, and we ask people to do different things. We ask them to listen to the emotion in that melodic interval, or we ask them to judge how far apart the pitches are. And when we ask them to listen for emotion, we see more engagement of this mirror system. So in this condition, this blue means desynchronization, which is another index of the mirror system. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed through quickly to some intervention work, but the other way in which we can see involvement of the motor system is through mimicry. So mimicry, basically, if I smile, you smile within a couple hundred milliseconds of my smiling. I'll try it. It's a fake smile, so it may not have worked. But the reality is you don't always see it, but we can measure it by looking at changes in electrical potentials in the zygomaticus muscle. Similarly, we can look for changes in laryngeal muscles when people are viewing singing. And we do see evidence for mimicry. So people are simply listening, and they're asked to make some judgment about what they're hearing, or they're listening and viewing, and we see this spontaneous activation of peripheral muscles. So I think a reasonable interpretation of this is that there's been some internal motor simulation, and we're seeing it on the periphery. So we see a little bit of evidence here in this EMG data. So I think I'd have to unpack this further, so you're going to have to take my word for it. Here we got it with repeated TMS, so it's a way of heightening the latent differences that are there in the EMG data. Okay, you see I have 5 minutes. So I got to get into some I got to move along here. So here's some mimicry data in song. So I can play the same song expressed happy.
Autumn leaves are turning red.
Okay, or I can play that song expressed sad. Same pitches, it's just a difference in expression and in facial manner.
Autumn leaves are turning red.
Okay, and then I can look at the EMG data and I see that for the happy production, I get much more zygomatic activity. All you're doing is listening, you're not reproducing. This is spontaneous. And I think it's linked to the mirror system activation that I was talking about earlier. You get the same sort of pattern with corrugator. So the model I'm proposing here, it's really a revisiting. For those of you that know the motor theory of speech perception, it's a revisiting of that theory. And I'm not arguing that the motor system is critical to understand music and emotional speech. There are other ways to do this. Association certainly is one of them. But there are certain instances where we're going to rely on motor simulation more heavily. So we can think about, well, what happens when something goes wrong in this whole system? So maybe we have some problems with sensory input. Maybe we have some problems with motor simulation. Theoretically, some impairment there, or the connectivity between the two should influence our ability to perceive music and emotional speech. I won't do too many of those graphics. Right? So the first one we'll look at is auditory motor connectivity problems. Okay, I argued they're important for processing rhythm at least, and probably other aspects of music. So another possibility is a problem with the sensory input, a problem with the motor simulation. Okay, can we rehabilitate this through some kind of focused simulation, the kind of work that happens when we're actually learning music? So if we actually encourage people to do vocal motor training, match pitches, this kind of thing, can we support the ability to do some of the things that I've been talking about? Well, the answer is yeah, sometimes, but sometimes absolutely not. So I'll start with a case where we absolutely can't do it. This is a famous tone-deaf individual. His name is Tim Falconer. He wrote a book on his tone deafness. And the thing about him is he loves music. Most people who are tone deaf stay away from music. This guy has a blog about music. And I was really excited when he called me up and said, I want to come to your lab. He called a bunch of music neuroscience people up and said, I want to figure out what's going on with me. And of course, eventually we turned this around and we wrote a paper on him. But he also wrote a very interesting book, and you can see lots of video about him. Along the way, while we were testing him and finding out what is atypical about him, the idea came up about, can I train myself out of the tone deafness if I do enough vocal pitch matching? So he hired the best jazz vocal coach he could find, and he worked with him for 18 months, and we tracked him on all sorts of indices. I won't tell you about many, but this is interval matching. And he's horrible. Like, his airs are around half an octave, which is, it's really outrageous. So he would, everyone says that they were singled out and told not to sing in the choir. He would be ushered out of the school. Like, there's that much of a disruptive intellect. So, it didn't improve. And when we look at the arcuate fasciculus, the structure connecting auditory and motor areas of the brain, we see that his arcuate fasciculus in red is much thinner than what is normal in purple. And that didn't change over the course of training. So we couldn't build that kind of connectivity up. So after a lifetime, like this idea came up earlier, after a lifetime maybe of reading music and the emotional world in a particular way, this we were not able to improve this, at least through this lens. Okay, so there's an interesting signal called the frequency following response. Animal work tells us that this signal is already being coded at the level of the midbrain. And basically what we have is populations of neurons in the inferior colliculus specifically that are firing not at the rate of the beat, but the rate of the frequency of the incoming signal. So if my voice is around 110 hertz, your cells in your inferior colliculus are firing 110 times a second. And as I inflect my voice, your ability to move your timing with me should reflect your ability to do certain musical and emotional speech tasks. So this ability drops off with age. This is what it's like at age 28. This is like what it's like at age 70. We know from correlational work that musicians represent this signal better than non-musicians. I'll play you an example, and it's actually going to be a recording of the EEG that we're playing back. So here's the signal that we present to people. If you're in our study, we play this about 4,000 times, unfortunately, and then this is what we get out, this is what we play back, this is what happens if you're a musician. It might sound like this. Not bad. Okay, if you're a non-musician, okay, there's much more noise in this signal. We're not capturing that fundamental frequency as much. So we wondered, can we support this through training? And so we've been running studies over the last few years where we're tracking this ability, and it seems that you can improve it in as little as 13 weeks. You can take older people with age-related hearing loss, and you can do vocal pitch matching. We do it by getting them involved in a choir, and then we get them to do homework, which is vocal pitch matching. You can improve this ability. So what? Well, there's all kinds of interesting things that come from choir singing, but one of the outcomes is that their ability to perceive speech and noise improves. We think that their ability to perceive emotion improves as well. We're not there yet. We've done similar work with children with cochlear implants. Here, the story is much different, but after 6 months of vocal pitch matching and music training, we find that we can improve their ability to perceive emotion in speech. I'm sure the situation is different there, but we can unpack it a bit more possibly at break or something. Parkinson's disease. This is an example of damage in motor areas now, basal ganglia, and that has downstream effects in motor planning areas. So that mimicry behavior I mentioned, where you smile when I smile, you don't see it in Parkinson's patients. So our group showed that the Parkinson's response to facial emotion presentations is delayed compared to age-matched normals, and the difficulty they have with facial mimicry actually predicts their response time in identifying emotion. So we found this motor behavioral link. Several groups have replicated this since this publication. So we asked a similar question: can we rehabilitate this through some kind of imitation training? We do this for 13 weeks. I'm just about done here. This is what it looks like.
Dogs are sitting by the door.
Kids are talking by the door. Dogs are sitting by the door.
The most obvious thing is that his voice is stronger, but we also found that his spontaneous mimicry of facial affect gets stronger, and it stays stronger after the training. The same is not true of the corrugator, the imitation of the frowning. I don't know why that is, but this is an interesting finding. So to summarize, the motor theory of speech perception has support, but only in a weak form, where motor seems most relevant in limited contexts, so situations where we have degraded speech. So think of the drunk, noisy speech we heard earlier, or in early development. But I think that motor theory may be particularly relevant for perception of music and emotional aspects of speech. We see engagement of the motor system in perception of rhythm, in vocal and vocal facial mimicry. And I also presented to you that there are various ways in which this sensory motor connectivity can go wrong. And maybe we can use music systematically to rehabilitate certain aspects of this sensory motor connectivity. Thank you for your attention.
I think we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, at the back.
Right at the back.
I can.
You can yell?
Loud.
Okay.
I had a question about, I've always wondered about this, the FFR research.
Yes.
In that, I thought that there was a limit to neural firing rates.
There is.
And that would, and so, I mean, how can you get, 1,000 hertz and things out of this?
Well, I think the upper limit of neural firing is probably somewhere around 1,500 hertz.
Yeah, I thought it was less, so that's.
But the beauty of, like, it maps onto the voice frequencies
Yeah.
perfectly. Like, voice frequencies, men are somewhere between 90 and 200.
200, yeah.
Women are going to be somewhere between 1 and 300. So the FFR captures the vocal pitch range perfectly.
For what you need. Okay. Yeah, like I said, it's just a confusion.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Time for one or two more questions?
Yeah.
I saw an article a year or two ago where they claimed that dogs could separately represent the emotional content and somatic content of speech.
No, I can't say. I would want to look for that. Yeah, that wouldn't map onto this at all. Like, if they can do it, then maybe they're doing it without this auditory motor connectivity. Maybe they're doing it through kind of like some of the color association work we were doing. We were listening to, like, enough associations with their owner doing bad things to them, sounding angry, etc. No involvement of a